Europe strengthens nuclear deterrent capabilities in response to Russia. Russia's military invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, along with related nuclear threats, has triggered a new wave of militarization in Europe. In addition to pushing for the NATO accession of Finland and Sweden, the perception of an increasingly unpredictable and vengeful Russia has compelled the alliance to enhance its deterrent capabilities. These efforts primarily focus on conventional forces, but there is also a discussion about bolstering nuclear deterrent capabilities. The strongest calls for this come from Poland, where leaders express a desire for U.S. nuclear weapons. Specifically, Poland aims to participate in NATO's nuclear sharing agreements, joining Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, countries possessing non-strategic B-61 nuclear bombs from the US and using dual-capable aircraft (DCA) to carry these bombs. While Poland has been interested in nuclear sharing since before February 2022, the seriousness of the consideration has increased since Russia announced in March 2023 its intention to share nuclear weapons with Belarus, where they claim to have deployed nuclear weapons. Other proposals under discussion include the development and deployment of new nuclear weapons, as well as dispersing non-strategic U.S. nuclear weapons to more locations in a crisis scenario to enhance the survivability of non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe after counterattacks. Many articles have opposed such proposals, arguing that NATO does not need to reinforce its already superior conventional strength by increasing dependence on mass destruction weapons. While sufficient defensive forces are necessary, especially at the alliance's eastern border, which has been reinforced through NATO's northward expansion, European nations should avoid excessive nuclear expansion to prevent escalation, arms race dynamics, and promote long-term solutions to continental security challenges. Initial theoretical basis for U.S. non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. Non-strategic nuclear weapons were first deployed in Europe in the 1950s, ensuring U.S. commitments to the defense of its allies. Unlike strategic weapons aimed at high-value targets deep in an adversary's territory, non-strategic weapons are designed for tactical use on the battlefield or in a war zone. Therefore, they are sometimes referred to as tactical nuclear weapons. Reflecting the Soviet/Russian-American relationship, these weapons are often distinguished from shorter-range strategic weapons. While locally, these weapons can cause horror similar to or worse than the events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, during the Cold War, non-strategic nuclear weapons were considered to provide options for using controlled nuclear weapons to avoid a doomsday scenario, a global nuclear catastrophe involving the strategic forces of both sides. NATO strategists believe that by lowering the threshold for using nuclear weapons in this way, non-strategic nuclear weapons would make NATO's deterrent threat more credible and therefore potentially more effective in deterring the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the basic logic of the escalation control assumes that if NATO uses non-strategic nuclear weapons or prevents a Soviet response in a similar manner, it could limit or even win a nuclear war. This reflects the power shift in Europe after the Cold War. Similar logical signs began appearing in Russian military theories and debates in the early 2000s. However, the escalation control logic is based on an unstable foundation. Assumptions that the first use of nuclear weapons may not necessarily trigger nuclear reactions and that a limited nuclear war is feasible are dubious. Moreover, as recent studies have emphasized, the humanitarian and environmental effects of nuclear weapons cannot be confined by national borders. Even a local nuclear exchange could have horrific global consequences by creating a nuclear winter. Non-strategic nuclear weapons as a means of assurance. After the end of the Cold War, the conventional power balance shifted in favor of NATO, rendering U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe nearly militarily insignificant. Through the 1991 presidential nuclear initiatives and the NATO Nuclear Planning Group's decision that same year, the number of U.S. non-strategic nuclear weapons deployed on the continent decreased from thousands to hundreds. Only the B-61 bombs capable of air delivery remained, while other types of non-strategic weapons were dismantled and destroyed by the U.S. The host countries of these weapons, Greece and the United Kingdom, eventually ceased nuclear sharing. High-level officials in Germany also proposed a similar course of action. However, the estimated 100 B-61 bombs still in Europe mainly symbolically emphasize the transatlantic nuclear sharing alliance. Particularly noteworthy is that after NATO's 2010 strategic concept, alliance statements linked further reductions in these items to the need for NATO-Russia complementary measures, given Russia's significantly larger non-strategic nuclear weapons stockpile. The symbolic importance of nuclear sharing has been heightened by Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the comprehensive military attack on Ukraine in 2022. In the increasingly uncertain European context, modernizing B-61 bombs and their delivery systems, including the advanced F-35 aircraft, has become more urgent. While annual exercises simulating the use of these weapons were previously less noticed, the current situation has brought more attention to them. Although the current circumstances have elevated the role of non-strategic nuclear weapons as a means of reassuring Europe's NATO allies, they have hardly provided new military justifications for these weapons. Deterrence works, but not with B-61 bombs. The conflict in Ukraine has deeply shocked Europe, but it does not mean that NATO's deterrent capability has failed. Russia's attack on Ukraine appears to have been driven by concerns about losing Ukraine to NATO. The perception of the Russian threat is dominated by the scenario of NATO continuing to expand its influence and is clearly expressed as leaders justify the reasons for the war. NATO's most important deterrent strength lies in the combination of political cohesion and advanced conventional forces that allies can mobilize for collective defense in a crisis. NATO has traditionally outpaced Russia in conventional forces before 2022, and their relative strength has increased further with the shift towards border defense through the recent northward expansion. These developments reinforce deterrence capabilities, especially in the Baltic region, considered a potential hotspot. In this scenario, Russia would use its local military advantage to quickly control territory before allies could mobilize forces. Furthermore, the conflict in Ukraine not only depleted Russia's enormous conventional resources but also demonstrated that Russia's precision-guided attack weapons were not as advanced as previously thought. Furthermore, Russia is hindered by the colossal nuclear arsenal of the United States' strategic nuclear forces, including nuclear-equipped submarines, long-range strategic bombers, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. This constant threat perception is orchestrated under NATO's guidance, forming the backbone of the expanded nuclear deterrence system. The U.S. strategic forces also include options for limited tactical nuclear attacks in line with escalation control logic. In addition to strategic bombers capable of carrying B-61 bombs without consulting allies, the U.S. has deployed W-76-2 warheads on its strategic submarines. Since 2022, the U.S. has increased signaling related to these forces, including enhancing the presence of strategic bombers flying and landing on the territories of allied countries, sometimes very close to the Russian border. Non-strategic nuclear weapons of the U.S., according to the NATO Nuclear Sharing Agreement, are not a reliable deterrent compared to the conventional forces of NATO and the strategic nuclear forces of the U.S. While replacing the outdated DCA with F-35 in case NATO conducts a nuclear attack on Belarus or Russia may enhance the ability to penetrate the opponent's air defense system. Such a decision requires not only the approval of the US and UK national leaders but also consensus within the NATO Nuclear Planning Group. This means that it is challenging for the 30 European democratic nations to agree on issuing orders for the first use of nuclear weapons or responding to a nuclear attack in a similar manner, potentially leading to a nuclear war. Even if allies can make such decisions, any NATO effort to control the escalation of the situation is hampered by the vulnerability of allied airbases to Russian retaliatory attacks. Moscow possesses thousands of nuclear weapons that could be used to destroy these bases, even if NATO successfully attacks Russian territory. Therefore, expanding the current nuclear sharing model to include new countries doesn't make much sense as an enhanced deterrent measure. Apart from increasing tensions, a new nuclear weapons base in Poland would add another target to the opponent's list in the event of a nuclear war. The U.S. nuclear weapons in Poland, to some extent, contribute to deterrence, not just due to the weapons themselves but also because of the deployment of ground forces accompanying the B-61 bombs. addressing the existing issue through dispersion, reflecting a partial acknowledgement of the reliability issue described above. Discussions are taking place behind closed doors within NATO regarding ways to enhance the survivability of non-strategic nuclear forces. The debate appears to focus on the strategy of dispersion, where U.S. non-strategic nuclear forces would be dispersed to various locations in Europe during crises. This would complicate the opponent's target selection against the opposing forces. This idea was also discussed in a September 2023 report by ISS. As a more feasible alternative to deploying nuclear weapons in Poland during peacetime, they suggest that NATO could designate some Polish air bases as potential dispersed operating bases to provide additional options for dispersing dual-capable aircraft during crises and close encounters. It also indicates that even if Poland does not have B-61 bombs, its F-35 aircraft could still be certified to deliver these weapons, and other member countries could take similar measures. As of now, only U.S. allies owning new nuclear weapons are allowed to operate DCA under the NATO nuclear sharing agreement. There are indications that some elements of the dispersion strategy have been implemented in the UK. The country maintains a national strategic nuclear deterrent force at sea but does not possess its own non-strategic nuclear weapons. According to a report by the Federation of American Scientists, the U.S. Air Force budget documents show that 15 years after the U.S. withdrew non-strategic nuclear weapons from the UK, the storage facilities for nuclear weapons at RAF Lakenheath are being upgraded. U.S. officials deny plans to redeploy U.S. nuclear weapons in the UK. The FAS report points out that this base could receive nuclear weapons in the future or in a crisis without necessarily deciding to deploy them permanently. The report also notes that construction projects for nuclear weapons bases in other host nations are designed to facilitate the rapid movement of weapons inside and outside the base to enhance flexibility in operations. Depending on the degree of implementation, the dispersion strategy could indeed complicate the opponent's target selection by creating uncertainty about the location of NATO's nuclear forces. However, in reality, Russia could counter this uncertainty by expanding the list of European targets in a hypothetical nuclear war, including potential nuclear weapons bases not previously known. This would impact a larger portion of the European continent with the destructive effects of a nuclear explosion. Moreover, widespread nuclear weapons do not eliminate the main factor undermining the deterrent value of NATO's non-strategic nuclear weapons. It is challenging to expect a group of major European democracies to collectively decide to turn their continent into a nuclear battlefield. Calls for Europe to possess new nuclear weapons in recent years. Some analysts have argued for deploying ground-launched intermediate-range missiles in Europe. These strategic weapons have ranges from 500 to 5,500 kilometers, considered to be between strategic and non-strategic weapons that were banned under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty in 1987, which Russia and the US withdrew from in 2019. Supporters note that this treaty was implemented only after NATO deployed intermediate-range missiles with nuclear weapons in 1983 in response to the Soviet Union's deployment of SS-20 missiles. They believe that a similar move today could pressure Russia into arms control. However, comparing the current situation with historical events is challenging due to tight control. The INF Treaty was the result of fortuitous conditions at that time, including the nature of the leaders of the Soviet Union and the US, their shared ambition to pursue nuclear disarmament, and the perception of the symmetry of intermediate-range nuclear forces. This led to mutual benefits in eliminating nuclear weapons. The likelihood of a similar scenario today is minimal. Conversely, deploying intermediate-range missiles in Europe is likely to provoke a response from Russia, exacerbating the arms race in the region. According to some proposals, even if equipped with conventional warheads, intermediate-range missiles also pose a particular escalation risk. Because they can penetrate deep into the opponent's territory, it is challenging to distinguish between nuclear and conventional warheads during a crisis. The October report from the U.S. Congressional Strategic Forces Subcommittee proposed a more advantageous suggestion regarding Europe's new nuclear weapons. It recommends increasing battlefield nuclear capabilities to deploy, survive, and provide flexible equivalent options. Although the authors do not specify the type of weapons they have in mind, recent U.S. discussions suggest that these weapons may include ground-launched intermediate-range missiles and sea-launched cruise missiles equipped with nuclear weapons, SLC-men. Unlike the dispersion strategy, which is unrelated to changes in nuclear weapons deployment during peacetime and may not cause significant public reactions, building nuclear capabilities related to new nuclear weapons will be challenging in Europe. This is particularly true if new air-to-ground missiles are introduced to the continent. Deploying SLC-men on U.S. attack submarines will attract less attention and thus less controversy among allied countries. However, it will pose challenges to the military relationships and cooperation between the U.S. and NATO members such as Denmark and Norway, which do not permit the transit of nuclear weapons through their territories or visits by nuclear-armed ships to their ports. As U.S. analysts have pointed out, deploying SLC-men, if done, will also trigger reactions from U.S. adversaries, increasing the risk of escalation and misunderstanding. It is challenging to expect a group of major European democracies to collectively decide to turn their continent into a nuclear battlefield. In summary, given the challenges and potential risks associated with the current nuclear sharing model, it is essential to think critically about the prospects of enhancing NATO's non-strategic nuclear forces. Any change should carefully consider the security environment in Europe, Russia's strategic nuclear forces, and the potential impact on arms control. Alternative measures such as the dispersion strategy may offer a more practical approach to improve the credibility of the existing nuclear sharing model. However, any decisions on changes to NATO's nuclear posture should be made collectively by the alliance members, and efforts should be made to ensure transparency, stability, and effective communication to prevent misunderstandings and reduce the risk of unintended escalation in the region.